This episode, we're going to jump right into writing a class and test to abstract the concept of external input. Specifically, the get and post superglobals in PHP. Along the way, I'll explain why this is helpful not only in an object-oriented design, but also in software design in general. Afterwards, I'll cover some of the additional use cases for this concept and a more targeted idea of what it leads to. First, in our test directory, let's open up input-test.php. We'll require input.php, and then we're going to create a new PHP unit test class, named the same as our file, input test. Starting off with our first test, let's create public function test can load from globals. In here, we'll assign superglobal get foo to be hello. Then we'll use a static factory method on the class input named create from globals, which will generate an instance of input that is constructed from the get and post superglobals. We'll store this to the variable input, and this is simply a convenience method that is something the Symfony HTTP Foundation component allows and a few other PHP frameworks. Next, we'll make an assertion that get foo is equal to input get foo. We'll make one more assertion that input get bar is null since it doesn't exist. This could be a separate test altogether, but for the sake of brevity, this will do just fine. On the first run of our tests, we can see that the input class is undefined. So we'll open input.php and then create a class named input. Our tests are now showing that input create from globals does not exist, so we can create this now. We'll write out public static function create from globals, and this will take no parameters. Inside of here, we're going to return a new instance of the class and pass along an associative array with get set to the superglobal get and post set to the post superglobal. Our tests now show that the method get does not exist on input, so we'll create that now. We'll write public function get, and this will accept one argument, the key that we want to fetch from. In here, we'll set result to be null, and if this inputs get key is set, we'll set the result to be the value of that. We'll then return result. Now we'll just declare inputs as a protected property at the top of the class and set it to be an array that contains the keys get and post, and both will be empty arrays. The tests now show a red failure that input get foo in our test is not actually retrieving the record. And this is because we haven't told our constructor what to do with its argument yet. So let's set that up now. The constructor is only going to take one optional parameter named inputs, and that can be an empty array by default. We'll iterate over all of this inputs to make sure that nothing but the keys that we set by our class get inserted. And if inputs key is set as well, we'll set the value of this inputs key to be that of the new array. Now that our tests are green, we know that we can create an instance of input that will set the values of get and post to whatever we pass in. And we have a static method that will set an instance of input to be the values of the superglobals. We should also create a method to allow us to replace the values of the input instance with new ones on the fly. So let's create a new test named test can replace input values. Next, we'll create the new inputs variable that is an array with the key get set to an array where foo equals hello, and then the key post set to an array where bar equals world. And inside of here, we'll say that input equals a new instance of input. We'll then call input replace and pass in new inputs. Now we'll make two assertions here. First, we'll assert that new inputs get foo is equal to input get foo like we did above. We'll then copy this and assert that post bar is equal to input post bar. Running our test tells us that input replace doesn't exist, so let's implement that now. Seeing a chance to reuse some code, we'll yank the body of the constructor and replace it with this replace inputs. Then we'll create the public function replace, which takes one parameter, inputs, and that can be optional, set as an empty array by default. And then we're going to paste the contents into the replace method. When we run our tests, we can now see that input post is undefined, so we'll implement that now. Since logic is the same for get, Let's extract this into a new protected method named fetch. Fetch will take two arguments. The first is the type of input to check, whether get or post, and the second is the key. We'll change the implementation for get to say input, and then we'll change the method get to return this, fetch, get, and key. We can then copy this method, change both of our gets to posts, and now let's try out our tests. We're all green, and our class is well tested. We are now safe to use this object in our system to represent user input. So why did we go through all this trouble? Well, get and post aren't always set, like from the command line or unit tests like the ones we've created. Manipulating the superglobals is generally frowned upon in PHP development, so that's already a strike against it. But also, you can allow for normalizations and other pre-processing to occur this way. And you can easily mock out the input layer in tests if you need to access the object or inject the input. Essentially, it's like calling a function that doesn't know about its outside world. You pass data in, you get data out. In our situation, we use an object to abstract and encapsulate related logic and functionality. Think of it as though you could have multiple sources of input, but you want a generic class to handle the input, whether it's command line arguments, get data, post data, JSON, etc. If you pass an object with a generic interface to some black box function that knows how to receive data from the object, it doesn't need to care about the several different sources it could come from. We'll revisit these principles in later screencasts, but I'm hoping you got an idea of why this is helpful in practice. Next episode, we're going to look into classical inheritance and also take a look into traits, which are one of the lesser understood features of PHP for sharing functionality.